Thank you for that warm welcome. Thank you for that introduction. And thank you for having me here today. My name is Paul Kerensa, and I'm suffering imposter syndrome at least twice. Firstly, I'm not an academic as such. I'm not a doctor, a professor. I'm not studying to be any of the above. I'm an independent researcher, writer, occasional broadcaster from, you might have passed the BBC studio on the way in, which is BBC Radio Surrey, the smallest, most local of radio stations that's half empty most of the time as they cover from Brighton, BBC Radio Sussex, the same thing there. But I've presented from here before and written for the BBC. In the last few years, I've become more of a broadcast historian and a podcaster behind this. It's probably an afeared thing among academics, these upstart podcasters, so please accept my apologies for that. And any ways in the next few minutes where I get things in a non-academic fashion or state the obvious and the like. Our latest podcast episode, in fact, is on the Early Recordings Association. We have an interview with Dr. Ines Stanovic on that. And on this earlier episode, we looked at the earliest BBC recording, but my presentation today includes some new information that I've found since. Secondly, in terms of imposter syndrome, I'm not so much forgive me, an early recordings enthusiast yet. I'm an early broadcasting enthusiast, especially early British broadcasting, especially the BBC. My third apology is that I can't join you for the entire conference, unfortunately, because I'm recording for the BBC later and tomorrow a drama about the early BBC, which also includes some references to gramophone records. By chance, on which, if anyone comes across the Tales of the Fairy Dustman by Phyllis Twigg, I'll be very excited to hear from you. I now know many databases to search, and also the problems with that. So I'd like to talk a little bit about where these early technologies cross over, broadcasting and recording, and the earliest BBC recording that we know of. Firstly, a little context: the British Broadcasting Company, as opposed to today's corporation, although effectively very similar things. It began in 1922 with a staff of 4, a listenership in the tens of thousands. And the notion of live was built into the whole selling point of broadcasting to encourage listeners in. So the very idea of recording anything back then really was anathema. The first BBC director of programmes, Arthur Burrows, who was also the first voice in the BBC, actually wrote to the Manchester BBC station just a few weeks in, chastising them for playing gramophone records. Live performance was the backbone of broadcasting, as he saw it. But it was Manchester, 2ZY, the radio station there, that played the first song on the BBC. It was day 2 of the BBC, and it was played on a gramophone record, not live, and it was Chrysler's Liebeslied on the 15th of November 1922. But forgive me, we'll move on. You can hear the entire piece on. I could tell you just wanted to hear more and more. We'll play it in the background. It's on YouTube if you'd like to hear it in the break, maybe. But I want to talk really not so much about records on the BBC. Maybe that's another route to go down another time. But recordings of the BBC. The BBC's first decade, 1922 to 1932, went almost entirely unrecorded. I feel it's a lost decade. 1931, the BBC rented their first Blattner-phone, 6mm steel tape, 5 foot per second, 20 minutes of recording time with near instant playback. And it was not to record for posterity, much as I wish it were. It was really for the BBC's new Empire service, which then became today's BBC World Service. So it was to broadcast VIP speeches in the middle of the night for other time zones. This device meant that only an engineer need be awake at 3 a.m. and not the speaker. There is a rare 1932 program called Pieces of Tape, which actually contains some of the Blattner-phone recordings.
Weaver giving a throw in to Arsenal. Arsenal through to Beston. Beston's through. He's going away now. The referee's blown his whistle. It's the end of the game. Result, Newcastle United 2, Arsenal 1.
So that's recorded in late 1932 and played out in early 1933. But again, almost entirely, all of the BBC broadcasts at this point were live, of course. The idea to actually record to preserve came in 1936, thanks to Marie Slocum and her assistant Tim Eckersley. More on him later. She was asked to tidy up some old discs, in other words, dispose of them. Instead, she noted that the recordings contained George Bernard Shaw, Winston Churchill, and others. And so Marie Slocum began what became the BBC's Sound Archive. In time, there were amassed collections of folk music, accents and dialects, sound effects, and historic recordings. But that's ahead of time as far as I'm concerned. The 1920s is what I wanted to look at. There is nothing, surely then, recorded of the BBC's first decade. Well, there are 3 recordings that I know of. So in reverse order, 2nd of January 1926, Jean Lanson's band from Ciro's Club in Covent Garden, London, about 30 miles in that direction, I believe. And it was recorded at the RCA in New York, because this was one of the first transatlantic broadcasts. So the quality is not good, and here it is.
Station 5FF, Toronto, England. Relaying a special program of music from Ciro's Club, London. This program is being relayed through the International High Power Station of Daventry and through the system of the...
Little flavours there of 5XX Daventry, London, and it's being sent over the Atlantic from Ireland to Maine and then onward to New York and Washington from there. So that's 1926. 1925, we also have what is, I believe, the first commercial transatlantic broadcast of Savoy Hotel Bands just next door to the BBC at Savoy Hill in London. This was recorded then on 78 wax masters, very unclear, although contemporary newspaper reports of the time say that listeners in Maine reported the signal was incredibly good, so there is a suggestion the interference came between Maine and New York.
All right, put on.
I will gladly share the full clips another time if you would like to, but I can't imagine many Americans dancing to that music, but maybe they did. But really my focus is on, in reverse order then, the first one before those, which is the 23rd of April 1924. George V opening the Empire exhibition at Wembley, hugely featured in the press. The quality is better because it's not crossing the Atlantic, and it's been relayed between Daventry, and it's not been relayed across, from Ireland to Maine. Let's have a little listen here.
But we can ask you to do this on St. George's Day. During the last stages of preparation, there have been many adverse factors, not the least of which was a very inclement winter.
A very inclement winter with the adverse conditions. The full, well, not the full recording, but a longer recording is available on YouTube. So this is the earliest known BBC recording. It's the world's first broadcast Monarch. I think it's remarkable that it was also had this incredible journey. It was recorded, lost, and found, arguably. And of course, one couldn't delve this deep into every single recording, not that I've necessarily delved deep enough, but I believe some recordings, to misquote Shakespeare, some recordings are born great, some recordings achieve greatness, and some have greatness etched upon them. So what was the event? Briefly, let's look at that. I could talk for a great length about the Empire Exhibition itself, but in a nutshell, the Empire Exhibition was just that. It was a chance to exhibit what was left of the British Empire. It was years in the planning, mostly led by the Prince of Wales, the King's son, future Edward VIII. Oddly, the Canadian corner of the exhibition actually thanked the Prince by having a life-size sculpture of him made out of butter for some reason. You can find pictures if you'd like. The exhibition also gave us Wembley Stadium, the world's first bus station, and displays from 58 territories. There was a telegram sent around the world in 1 minute 20 seconds, sent from one hand of the king and delivered back to him just over a minute later. So King George V was set to open the event, and the BBC had been eager to broadcast him for some time. John Reith, at this point the BBC managing director, had been inviting him for at least over a year. A year earlier, the BBC had tried broadcasting the wedding of the King's son, the future George VI, to Elizabeth, the future Queen Mother. But the Dean of Westminster refused this application to broadcast, citing that men might listen in pubs with their hats on. Always a risk. Reith asked the King for a Christmas broadcast in 1923, but again was refused by the palace. But for 1924's exhibition, the broadcast was secondary. The King would be speaking anyway, so Reith sent him a free radio set, and the King agreed. The Hull Daily Mail said, the biggest thing in wireless history so far as the British Isles are concerned. Hundreds of thousands will, through the broadcasting of the speech, be enabled to hear His Majesty's voice for the first time. The King will be brought into a closer contact with hundreds of thousands of his subjects at one time, a thing undreamed of a few years ago. There had been an HMV record released the previous year, Empire Day 1923, of the King and Queen, but this broadcast would potentially reach more people. John Reith, heading the BBC, thought that 1 million might listen. Actually, nearer 10 million did, largely thanks to newspapers. They trailed the event, but they also set up loudspeakers in 200 town centres across Britain for those who did not yet have wireless. There was still a minority of people who were listeners at this point. So the Daily Chronicle here lists the town centres across Britain where they would hang these loudspeakers, and then other newspapers joined in as well. The Daily Mail wired up streets in Leeds, Manchester, Glasgow. Picture houses, newspaper offices, town halls, buildings at docks would all have these loudspeakers amplifying the King's speech. The Hull Daily Mail said hundreds of thousands will, through the broadcasting of the speech, be able to hear His Majesty's voice for the first time. It is pleasing to reflect that wireless telephony will thereby play a by no means inconsiderable part in stimulating a new wave of patriotism. I find it interesting in today's world to see the use of broadcasting as an automatically good thing to stimulate patriotism, but there we are. The papers went crazy over this in Britain. All the newspapers trailed it. The BBC's engineering department, meanwhile, were busy with logistics. Chief engineer of the BBC, Peter Eckersley, enjoyed telling the tale of the hours of meetings between the BBC and the palace about where the King would stand and where the microphone would be, or microphones, I should say, given the stately occasion and also the monarch's microphone scepticism. He was very reluctant. Hours went by until a brown-coated, flat-capped BBC workman rose through a platform in the stage like Banquo's ghost and said, "King stands here, microphone stands here, meeting over." Peter Eckersley's brother, Roger Eckersley, of the BBC programme department, was tasked with finding a lion to roar on cue to open the exhibition. And as the day came, it became clear that really, as far as the audience were concerned, it was just about the King, hearing him speak. It was a must-hear moment. So on the 23rd of April, St George's Day, it began at 10:30. The King's speech due at 11:30, but first at 10:23, the tuning note, and then voices testing the signal. The newspapers report that it could be heard saying, "Wembley testing for British Isles, all nations and prosperity of your empire." And then the workmen were reading out adverts for cough lozenges from the newspaper. Normally such advertising was banned on the BBC, but this was just a way of testing the line. Then there were marching brass bands, Elgar conducting his own anthem, and then the sharp words of command to the Guard of Honour rang out clearly, said the Hull Daily Mail. One could hear the click of the men's heels as they came to attention. A fanfare, cheering crowds, the national anthem, listeners at home stood to attention as they listened. The Prince of Wales spoke as clear and distinct in every syllable as a gifted actor. 12 years later, he would abdicate via radio. But for now, he introduced his father, and traffic stopped on Oxford Street to listen. Court proceedings paused, a government inquiry halted. No other monarch has at any time spoken to anything like such a number of hearers, and the thing was made possible simply and solely by the microphone, the Hull Daily Mail once again. After the King, the Bishop of London said the Lord's Prayer. It was, as far as I can tell, the most heard prayer in history at that point. The paper said every word could be distinguished, more so than the royal speeches. That, of course, was because the words of the Lord's Prayer were familiar. The chief engineer, Peter Eckersley, said telegrams were received from John O'Groats to Land's End, distinctly hearing it, even a listener in Poughkeepsie, New York. But many would-be listeners were working, so how to make sure they listened? And that is why it was recorded. Different microphones then served different purposes. Here we go. The BBC had their round Sykes microphone, there for broadcasting, each one finished in gold. It was a small box covered in cloth, and one observer said it looked like the king was talking to a small bird cage. Alongside that were Western Electric microphones linked to the loudspeakers in the venue to amplify it via a PA. But separately then, the HMV Gramophone Company were recording it. From the Scotsman, 24th of April 1924, a record of His Majesty's speech was made with the BBC's permission by the HMV Gramophone Company from a loudspeaker at their works this morning. The acoustic method, recording horn in front of a loudspeaker. But it was not recorded for posterity, but because the King has graciously granted us permission, the article says, to broadcast this record. It was represented to His Majesty that although millions heard the speech in the morning, there were vast numbers unable to listen in at that hour of the day. This record will be broadcast from all BBC stations soon after 10 o'clock this evening. The BBC at this point had never had a repeat in that sense. So it's rush processed into finished shellac records, ready for rebroadcast that evening. It was the BBC's first repeat of many. Whenever they repeated dramas, they would restage the entire drama. But here, for the first time, I underappreciated, I think. I've seen no reference to this in any book or timeline on the BBC website or online or in any history book I could find. This is the BBC using a recording to rebroadcast. So I imagine then weeks went by and the papers printed what the papers printed. A lot of coverage of the speech, a picture there of one of the loudspeakers used to amplify it over the occasion. And a couple of months later, 23rd of June, we see this from the Dundee Courier. King's voice for posterity. The King has accepted from His Majesty's Voice Gramophone Company a royal blue Morocco album tooled in gold containing copies of the gramophone records of his speech at the opening of the British Empire exhibition, made from wireless broadcasting of the speech by the British Broadcasting Company. The speech exactly long enough to fill 2 12-inch records. Peter Eckersley was the one to arrange this, the chief engineer of the BBC. I have no evidence, and I know assumptions are dangerous, but I have no evidence that the same record that was used to rebroadcast was the same one now given to the King. All I know is that from these articles, the BBC had a recording, and then they gave a recording to the King, and then later they said that they didn't have a recording. So I wonder if the BBC gave away their only copy. There are copies listed. I'm pleased to have heard Kelly's catalogue mentioned already, and I found these in Kelly's. It says at the top here, I'll read it because it's very small print. Frank Andrews is already mentioned as well, which is lovely. Never issued, shells destroyed. Frank Andrews reported that the medals were sent to the British Museum with the King's approval after a set has been sent to Buckingham Palace. Frank Andrews mentions Edward Fowler's report that the recording of the King's speech was, quote, the first experimental record made by electrical recording. I don't know about that. Maybe someone here does and can correct me. Hillendale News reports HMV sought to record from a high-powered wireless receiving set which amplified all the atmospherics and Morse code signals from a nearby station, which all but obliterated reception from Wembley. These ceased just before the King's speech, which was successfully recorded on 2 12-inch records. And the last bit there at the very top says a copy of the speech in the library comes from a private recording made by Mr. Jones at his laboratory in Croydon. And the last bit I want to mention is just about who Mr. Jones was and what that recording was, because I find this particularly interesting. This is not Mr. Jones. This is Leslie Bailey, a BBC producer and presenter of the Scrapbook programme. Scrapbook was from 1933 to 1974, 41 years, pretty good going. Leslie Bailey's programme on the BBC, Scrapbook for different years. You would pick a year and present and recreate some of its events. But often, without archive, they would employ actors and sound effects. So for Scrapbook for 1924, for example, they wanted to present what the Empire Exhibition was like. They represented the Empire Exhibition's giant racer roller coaster by rolling an office chair over a thunder sheet and mixing in the sound of a London Underground train. A 1955's edition of Scrapbook for 1924, Leslie Bailey told listeners that it was such a shame there was no recording of George V. He had seemed to be unaware the BBC ever had a recording, even if just for a few weeks, back in 1924, then gave it to the King, perhaps. He told this tale on Desert Island Discs, the popular BBC show still on today. In 1964, he was a guest of Roy Plomley.
Well, I wouldn't say it's thanks to me, it's thanks to one of our listeners. We had done a scrapbook of the Wembley year in which we said that there was no recording at all of the King opening that exhibition because recordings weren't done in those days. And this lady said we were wrong because her husband was a technician who had himself privately recorded the King in his own back porch on his own machine. And so she had a record of the King, and she very kindly sent us a copy of this. And the next time we did a scrapbook of that year, we put that record in.
I hope the BBC is keeping for posterity all the stuff you've dug up.
Oh, yes, everything is kept.
Let's have record number 5, then.
The last bit there was Roy Plomley saying, I hope the BBC is keeping for posterity everything that you found. He says, oh yes, everything is kept, which I now know to be a complete lie. So that's Mrs. Dorothy Jones of Croydon and her husband, Mr. Jones. Don't know his first name. I have tried to find it. I believe he worked for Columbia, but at this point, 1924, not at this point, he was long gone at this point, but 40 years earlier, 23rd of April 24, Mr. Jones was at home recording the King's speech for fun onto a metal disc, pointing his radio speaker at a homemade acoustic recording machine. Mrs. Jones, 40 years later, sent that metal disc to the BBC. 3 decades since the BBC... 4 decades even, since, no, 3 decades, sorry, this is 1964 when Desert Island Discs was talking about it, but it was 1955, 3 decades after the BBC gave away this recording to the Palace. That is when Mrs. Dorothy Jones sent it back to the BBC. There we go. That's 23rd of February was when the broadcast was, the plea was given saying we have no recording, and she responded. So it's thanks to the Joneses we have that recording. So I was curious then, just by way of epilogue, you'll be delighted to hear, about the copy that the BBC gave George V in 1924. And I don't know if it's normal to be as obsessed as I clearly am about that recording, given we now have a recording by the Joneses. So clearly something matters not just about the actual event that we hear, but actually that physical copy. I want to know what happened when the BBC gave it to the Palace. Does the Royal Archives still have it today in 2025? So when I met Dr. Inya Stanovic and she mentioned this conference, I thought this is the perfect time to ask the Royal Archives. A deadline like this conference made me finally get in touch. I emailed them in March of 2025. I explained the backstory. I shared the newspaper cuttings as proof that the recordings were given to the Palace. I inquired about the recordings and even stated they might possibly be in a royal blue album if you look very carefully. And I received a reply from Julie Crocker, the senior royal archivist at Windsor Castle, who by chance was a former BBC archivist herself. She said, "Dear Mr. Kerensa, thank you for your inquiry concerning a recording of George V's speech at the British Empire Exhibition in 1924. We do have a recording, but don't get your hopes up, because this is the recording that they have." There it is. So we do have a recording, which, as you will see, was presented to Queen Elizabeth II in 1955, in a recording which also features a speech by the then Prince of Wales at the Empire Exhibition. I'm not sure this is what you are looking for, as we do not have an original gramophone record from 1924, but presumably the BBC must have had the original recording in 1955 in order to create this copy to give to the Queen. Presumably, she said. Once again, another assumption. The BBC gave the recording to the Palace, presuming the Palace would keep it. The Palace presumed the BBC have the original recording. No, the BBC do not have that 1924 original, and clearly neither do the Palace. The Royal Archivist presumes that was the case. But I notice, out of interest, the timing. I don't know if you can see fully there. I will read bits of it. 20th of October 1955 is the date that record was sent to Queen Elizabeth II. 1955, the same year that Mrs. Dorothy Jones of Croydon gave her copy back to the BBC again. So once again, I have no evidence of this particularly, but I note the timing. I put this to a friend of mine, the former BBC head archivist Simon Rooks, who confirmed that this record just on site says the disc pictured is definitely 1950s vintage. The label design, the sound archive accession number 21525. Numbers were given sequentially. The 20,000s range is about right for 1955. So he would say this does support a 1955 date for this record. It looks then, I think, like the Queen, Elizabeth II, in 1955 was given Mr. Jones's bootleg version. The Royal Archives did not know this and thought it was the BBC's original copy. One last thing as we climb out of this rabbit hole. The first Monarch, the earliest BBC recording, lost then found, but at the heart of it, I find it fascinating. There are two of Britain's most globally familiar heritage brands, the Royals and the BBC. But this is how small a world it is. The Royal Archives record that we have here, presented in 1955 to Queen Elizabeth II by the BBC, as you could see in this picture, it says, from the Secretary to the AHCP Ops, brackets REC. Now, the BBC love an acronym. It is an acronym. AHCP Ops, brackets REC, I had to look this up, means Assistant Head of Central Programme Operations Recordings. So, you might recall I mentioned at the very start of this, Marie Slocum, who began the BBC Sound Archive with her assistant Tim Eckersley. Well, Tim Eckersley was still at the BBC in 1955, 20 years after that point. At that point, his job was the Assistant Head of Central Programme Operations Recordings. So that is who sent it. Tim Eckersley sent this record to Queen Elizabeth II. Tim Eckersley's uncle was Peter Eckersley, the chief engineer who gave the palace the recording in 1924. Tim Eckersley's dad was Roger Eckersley, the man who was tasked with finding a lion to roar on cue to open the exhibition. So what we have is two related Eckersleys presenting recordings of the same speech to two related Windsors a generation later. The Eckersley family giving the same recording, well, the same event recorded twice to the same Windsor family. History repeating itself. Gladly, the recording is now on YouTube for all to hear, although it's only a part of it, but it's not the BBC nor the Crown, perhaps, that we thank for preserving it so much as the everyday couple from Croydon, the Joneses. You don't need me to tell you about the fragility of archive, clearly, or indeed keeping records of recordings. When even a notable recording such as this falls through the cracks, and when assumptions are made from two of our biggest organisations that the other probably has it, and I can't see that this really has been written about or reported much, I think it illustrates just how tricky it is to preserve. So I'm glad of the Early Recordings Association and the work that it has done and clearly will do for future generations of Eckersleys, Windsors and Joneses to enjoy these recordings for years to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So